Your own podcast, moving up in the world. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Hey, everybody. I am here with Dr. Anders Bergstrom of the Crick Institute. Dr. Bergstrom, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, so I'm a researcher at the Francis Crick Institute in London, UK, and I work on human population genetics research, population history, but also similar questions in dogs and wolves.
Yeah, so before we get into the detail of this paper, so we have a paper out in Science that's pretty exciting. Can you talk about like how the two are similar, like why you are working in both of them? Because if you were working in population genetics of like maize or something, it would be weird, I think, for you to also be a human population geneticist. But I feel dogs and humans are somewhat closer. Like, why would you say that is?
Well, I mean, I think there are people who work on plants as well as humans and a range of species, and I think in the end it's all DNA, it's all genomes, so the same kind of evolutionary processes that underlie human evolution are relevant in other species as well. So it's therefore actually quite simple to switch between organisms, because of course they all have their own histories and their own backgrounds, but the methods that we use are essentially the same. And of course, with dogs, we have, of course, it's a mammal species. It has similar biology, similar reproductive systems, and so on. So it's actually quite straightforward to apply methods from population genetics to any of these species.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. I mean, as some listeners might know, I mean, some biologists would accuse geneticists of not being very into organisms, not knowing much about organisms. But as you're saying, the focus here is on a common system of inheritance and figuring out, just these general processes. So that is portable. And I do want to just name check your paper. It's in Science, and it is Origins and Genetic Legacy of Prehistoric Dogs. And you are the first author, and Pontus Skoglund is the last author, so it's out of the Skoglund lab. I think the title says it all in a way, so that's why I wanted to say that for the listeners. I want to ask you a question. Do you think that there's any difference between the origin of the dog lineage and the domestication of dogs?
Yes, certainly. I mean, this is still something we don't really understand. The domestication of dogs. Um, it's still somewhat of a mystery, but I think we can still assume that. And I mean, well, first of all, I think it's pretty clear at this point that dogs they derive from gray wolf populations, as opposed to some other species of canids. Um, and at some point, there would have been a wolf population that would have been ancestral to dogs. And there would have been some period of time in which they were not yet domesticated, but were still somewhat separated from other wolf populations. So the point in time at which they separated from other wolves is not necessarily the same point in time at which dogs were domesticated. That would necessarily have happened later. But we still have a very just a very superficial understanding of these events, when they happened, and especially where they happened. It is still basically a mystery, and in this paper we don't really manage to solve it either, even with ancient dog genomes. It is still an outstanding question, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I did notice that. So just to be clear for the listener, the paper focuses kind of on the separation of these five macro lineages that were present at the beginning of the Holocene, 11,500 years ago, and they kind of give rise to the various types of dogs we see around us, and we'll get into the details of that. I want to step back and talk about what you just said there because I think that's kind of implicit, and I've kept track of the dog domestication and origin literature for various reasons as well. And it seems like the separation of dogs from wolves probably happened in the last 50,000 years. Would you say that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think
Yeah.
most people would say that it's somewhere between, let's say, 15 and 30,000 years ago. That's kind of what people have estimated by comparing present day dog and wolf genomes to each other, for example. Um, and from the archaeological record, we know that dogs were probably domesticated something like 15,000 years ago or earlier. You start to see individuals
Hmm.
appearing in the archaeological record that look more like dogs. They're smaller in size than wolves, and so on. Um,
Yeah.
there are even earlier suggested reports of dog-like individuals, but they're less accepted and perhaps might just reflect variation
In
in
wolves.
wolf morphology. But I think at 15,000, everyone agrees that the dogs have probably been domesticated, um, and
Well,
so
so
probably largely separated genetically then from other gray wolves.
yeah, and like to give a context, that's in the during the Ice Age. It's right after the last glacial maximum. So, we're talking a Pleistocene event here. So I guess the question here with wolves and dogs, and I want to be clear on this because I think it's kind of implicit in the paper. It's obviously not a focus. Um, there is no specific wolf lineage, modern wolf lineage, that it looks like dogs are perhaps derived from more than other wolf lineages, right? There's kind of reciprocally monophyletic is how we would say it. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So, in principle, the question of dog origins could have been simple if there was one one wolf population of wolves in some part of the world that were basically a sister lineage of dogs. Then you can say that, okay, this is probably the origin. Um, but that's not the case, unfortunately. So instead, as you say, wolves today are similar to each other, and dogs today are similar to each other. That's a kind of big picture. And of course, probably wolves themselves have changed over the last 15,000 years. So we wouldn't necessarily expect that the wolf population that gave rise to dogs is still around in unchanged form. Maybe it has gone extinct, or maybe it has mixed so much with other
Hmm.
populations that you cannot recognizably detect it. So that makes the whole problem very difficult. And there's probably a whole bunch of admixture as well, uh, between dogs and wolves after domestication, which makes this thing even more complicated.
Yeah, and so in your paper, well, I mean, to step back from that, I think I want to restate this for the listener. It's often said, or it was said, I think it's said less now, that dogs are basically just a type of wolf, which makes sense in a way because their ancestors were probably wolf-like. But when you say that, a lot of people get the impression that dogs are derived from modern wolves, which they're not. They're more like we call it sister lineages, right? I mean, would that be a correct way for me to say that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, genetically, they are closely related to wolves, um, but they're also distinct. And
Hmm.
of course, behaviorally, typically in terms of their traits and behavior, they have changed quite a lot
Yes.
compared to wolves. So maybe that's the most relevant distinction.
Yeah.
Of course, there are still no problems to produce fertile offspring, for example, between dogs and wolves. But behaviorally, they are now quite a different thing.
Well, I mean, we have dingoes who are feral dogs. So I think one way that I like to think about this is how different are wolves and dogs is when dogs become feral and you leave them feral for thousands of years, as the case is with the dingo, they don't turn back into wolves. I mean,
Hmm.
they're different enough where they just don't naturally evolve back into their ancestral wolf state or whatever. They've changed enough. So I think that's one way I like to think about it. You do talk somewhat about admixture between dogs and wolves, and the impression that I get, or not the impression, what I read in the paper and my understanding, is there's considerably more gene flow from the dog lineages into the wolves than vice versa.
Yeah, so that's the impression that we get in this paper. And I mean, just on a superficial level, I mean, as we mentioned, our basic idea is that wolves and dogs are basically two separate lineages, and within each of these lineages, everyone is more similar to each other than they are to anyone from the other lineage. But in practice, that's not actually the case in many situations, and often you find asymmetries. You find that some dogs are closer to some wolves and vice versa. So this means that there must have been a lot of gene flow between these. But we estimate that it has probably been more in the direction of dogs to wolves rather than in the other direction from wolves into dogs. Of course, there are known examples of specific dog breeds where people have purposefully bred wolf ancestry into them to obtain certain traits and so on. But perhaps that was not a very widespread practice in prehistory.
Mhm.
And perhaps dog populations actually have remained relatively uniform without much contributions from wild wolf populations.
So I worked at a company once that did genetics of dogs, and occasionally we would be asked to validate claims that a dog was part wolf because they were purchased in that way. For some reason, these people often lived in Montana. I don't
Okay,
know why. I think it's partly the laws. They're not totally legal everywhere.
right.
But we would be sent pictures along with some DNA, and this one dog came back. It was supposed to be a wolf dog. It was a three-fourths wolf dog genetically, and we
Okay.
looked at the picture and we were just saying, like, how could you think that this was half dog? I mean, it was like a giant wolf-looking animal. So
Yeah.
people have some interesting thoughts sometimes about what's a wolf and a dog. Sometimes you can just look at them, right?
Hmm.
I do think one thing, when you talked about the admixture result, is historically there was probably way more dogs, right? I mean, what would you think?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, in certain places, certainly, whereas in other places there would have been more wolves.
Hmm. Hmm.
But yes, I mean, certainly in human contexts, you can certainly imagine that even if there was a bit of mating with wild wolves, that perhaps it didn't have a big impact on the dog populations that were hanging around with humans.
Hmm. Hmm. All right, so let's talk about the meat of the paper uh that we are discussing here in a roundabout way. And it's basically, so it seems like you find three big, well separated populations of dogs, ancient dogs, prehistoric dogs, in your ancient DNA sample, which is 27 individuals. And, for the listeners out there who are asking and thinking, how could you figure out so many things with 27 individuals? When you have whole genome sequences of whatever quality, well, not of whatever quality, but of reasonable quality of a single individual, that's actually giving you access to a huge pedigree. So, these 27 individuals might have millions of markers, per individual. So, don't be, confused by that. So that's a lot of information. And so, Anders, it seems like you guys found about 5 lineages at the beginning of the Holocene. So that's 11,500 years ago, end of the Ice Age, kind of right around when agriculture is starting in the Middle East. Can you talk about just generally those 5 lineages and how just established that there were 5 of them?
Right. Yes. So as you say, this is the end of the Holocene, and as we discussed earlier, I think no one will be surprised that there were dogs at this time. So as we said, they probably were domesticated at least 15,000 years ago. But so what we find is that not only were there dogs at this time, but they were kind of, well, first of all, the dog ancestry was kind of fully formed. So even the earliest individual, which is 11,000 years in our data set, is easily recognizable as a dog. It's not some kind of halfway between dog or wolf thing, but it's a fully formed dog ancestry by that time. And also, we can already see diversification of dogs. So there are already different, so to speak, branches, genetic branches of dogs that have probably started to spread across the world. So we could basically infer a likely relationship between some of the key representatives. So we pick some of the oldest and geographically most representative individuals from our 27 dogs and try to relate them to each other. And the kind of phylogeny or population history model that we obtain implies that this diversification process must have started before 11,000 years ago, probably probably several thousand years before that as well. And so I think the number 5 is not necessarily a magic number. I think it's limited by our data. If we had additional genomes from more diverse parts of the world, we would probably have found additional diversity at this time. But to briefly discuss these branches that we do find, and it's notable that they are all basically to varying degrees still represented today in present day dogs. So one of them is an ancestry associated with a 7,000-year-old dog from the Levant, from Israel. And maybe we'll talk later about African dogs, but this ancestry is basically very much represented in present-day African dogs. And so it is one of these major early dog lineages. Then we have another one which is associated with early dogs in northwestern Russia, so kind of on the edges of Europe, where we have a dog from present-day Karelia. And this one likely contributes to later European dogs. And then a third major branch is that associated with 7,000-year-old dogs from Lake Baikal in southern Siberia. And these probably contribute quite a lot to present-day dogs in Siberia and in the North American Arctic. And then a fourth branch is kind of similar to this Siberian dog ancestry, but it's also somewhat distinct, and that's ancestry associated with pre-Columbian American dogs. So these are genomes from a previous study where they managed to isolate DNA from pre-Columbian dogs in the Americas, and these we can also see represent a major lineage of early dog diversity. And then the last one is associated with ancestry in present-day New Guinea singing dogs and Australian dingoes. So we think of this as a kind of a Southeast Asian type of dog ancestry. So probably these dogs in New Guinea and Australia, they are somewhat recent arrivals from Southeast Asia, and so we kind of think of it as a type of ancestry that likely existed in East Asia and China prior to 5,000 years ago or so. So those are kind of the major lineages that we identify. But again, these are not necessarily the 5 lineages. There's probably more, and of course, to some extent, we think we present them or talk about them as distinct entities. But of course, these might to some extent reflect continuous population structures. But it's a way to think about and present this early diversity that existed already at the end of the Ice Age, before the advent of agriculture and before any other animal had been domesticated. So by this time, dogs had already diversified and likely spread across much of the northern hemisphere and North America and Eurasia. And again, much of this diversity is actually still represented in present-day dogs. So some popular breeds that you see on the street, the diversification process that separated them, in some cases, will have started already in the late Pleistocene.
Hmm. Well, I mean, I want to I always forget these dates. And so with the Southeast Asian dogs, with the dingo, humans have been in Australia for 45,000 years, a long time, right? But
Mhm.
the dogs, the dingo is actually relatively recent, and so I'm looking up right here, and they're saying that the earliest skeletal remains are maybe like 3,500 years ago or so. It's pretty tentative, but it's like a tenth as long,
Yeah.
right? And in Southeast Asia, they're a little earlier, but they're not so much earlier. And I didn't know this, so it seems like in Southeast Asia, the dogs are probably showing up with agriculturalists because the earliest reliable dates are in Vietnam 4,000 years ago, which coincidentally is when I know for a fact that the rice farmers show up in Vietnam. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to imagine that um, people associated with the Austronesian expansion, or these Southeast Asian people who come down from Southeast Asia, brought dogs with them as they traveled into the Pacific, and they reached New Guinea and Australia, and that this basically explains how the dingo got to Australia.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, so and also, the thing with the dingo is, unfortunately, the dingo is the reason that various predatory marsupials or the Tasmanian what was like Tasmanian wolf, I think, was a mainland organ animal as well for a while. And the dingo outcompeted it. I mean, there's a variety of things, but I believe that there is a legend in some northern Australian group, Aboriginal group, where they're basically describing the dingo. The legend of the origin of dingo involves them running around in a boat. So I mean,
Okay. Yeah.
it's pretty clear there that they have some oral memory of when the dingo first showed up, because the dingo's not been there for ever and ever, right? It's a
Mhm.
relatively recent arrival, and so I want to talk about these lineages, and I think you put it in good perspective in terms of understanding how these five lineages should be thought of, because they're probably not exhaustive, but you have a lot of genomes. You have a lot of ancient genomes as far as ancient genomes go. I think I would be willing to bet you're 80 to 90% there, in terms of like capturing the ancient diversity, like looking at your sampling area and the number of samples you have. And also, they do a pretty good job, as you're saying, explaining the modern variation, because there are ways that you could have inferred ghost lineages, right? Like, did you try to do that? And there was nothing there? Or, I mean,
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, and I think, yeah, we're not really sure of whether or not, let's say we had 10,000-year-old dogs from a whole bunch of other places like Central Asia or East Asia and so on. I think it's definitely possible that there could still be major lineages that we haven't found, so to speak, genetically. Um, but as you say, we do have the modern genomes, and um, there doesn't at least seem to be among present day dogs any major ancestry or type of ancestry that is completely unrepresented by our ancient genomes. Of course, there could have been ancestries that have been lost since then, divergent branches of dogs that might no longer exist. In which case, the only way to find them would be to get ancient genomes.
well, so let's talk about in turn. Let's talk about Europe and the Levant first. So, European dogs are a combination of these Karelian dogs and the Levant dogs, correct? Like, can you talk about not, I don't say ethnogenesis, but the canine genesis of the European dog families from these two ancestral populations?
Right. Yeah. So we find that this 11,000-year-old Karelian dog, which is the oldest dog in our data set, and so Karelia, that's close to present day St. Petersburg in Russia, close to Finland and Estonia. Um, we find that despite its geographical location, kind of in the northeastern corner of Europe, it displays a lot of affinities with Eastern dogs, so dogs in Siberia and these pre-Columbian American dogs. And then in the Levant, at a similar time period, we have these very different dogs that, again, are more similar to present-day African dogs. And then when we look at European dogs, they are basically distributed on a cline in between these two, so between the Levantine and the Karelian dogs. And there's a kind of wide variation in their ancestry. So some European dogs, especially in Northern Europe, are more similar to this Karelian or ultimately more Siberian-looking type of dogs, whereas others, especially in Southern Europe, are more similar to the Levantine dogs. So what we think happened here is that these two distinct ancestries, the kind of Near Eastern related and the Siberian related, came together in Europe, and these two distinct populations mixed with each other to give rise to European dogs that we see starting from the Neolithic and forward. And that this great variation among European dogs reflects this admixture process. So it's a kind of incomplete merging where dogs, especially in the south, retain more of this Near Eastern affinity, and those in the north retain more of the Siberian-related affinity.
Mm.
So we think this basically reflects, as you said, a kind of dual ancestry of European dogs and a kind of fundamental admixture event at some point in the past.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. Did you guys not have just results from Western European samples? I'm just curious because you mentioned Western Europe in there really quickly, but we don't have any DNA from that, right?
So we do have Western European samples from the Neolithic and onwards.
Mm.
However, we don't have any pre-Neolithic European samples. So the very oldest European dogs, kind of
Mm.
before 10,000 years ago, we unfortunately don't have DNA from any of those. So and this kind of plays into the question of how did this ancestry line across Europe form? So we speculate in the paper that actually part of this, at least part of this admixture in European dogs, could be the product of the first farmers from the Near East migrating into Europe and bringing their dogs with them, and perhaps the dogs that lived in Europe before agriculture were more like these Siberian dogs, and that there was then this kind of Neolithic migration into Europe that brought the Near Eastern ancestry into the continent and then mixed with the hunter-gatherer dogs, so to speak, which would have been more European-like. So that's an hypothesis. As I said, unfortunately, we don't have DNA from the very earliest European dogs. But under this hypothesis, you might suspect that they would have been more Siberian-looking in their ancestry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel that one of the you know, priors we haven't mentioned explicitly here are the affinities of Mesolithic and Neolithic European human populations. So, um, I'm assuming that there's some really good archaeological sites in Karelia, and it's cold, and that's why we have a lot of DNA from humans from Karelia as well. So, it's familiar to anyone who keeps track of the ancient DNA literature. And so, these Karelian humans are also known to have affinities with Paleo Siberians. So, I wouldn't be surprised, just speculating here, that the Siberian affinity is just due to the ancestral North Eurasian populations that flourished during the last glacial maximum might have had dogs that they spread, west and east. I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so there are some interesting parallels here between dog relationships and human relationships, and we actually look at this a little more explicitly in this paper as well by analyzing ancient human genomes from previous studies that we match in time and space to the dog. So for each ancient dog, we kind of pair it up with an ancient human, and then we can do various co-analyses of humans and dogs at the same time. Um, and there are some interesting parallels. So as you say, there are these known from the human literature connections throughout northern Eurasia. So populations in Europe display links to early populations in Siberia, and in fact even populations in the Americas. So Native American humans, um, they are not simply uh, the descendants of people in East Asia, but about a third of their ancestry comes from some population that has affinities to people in Western Eurasia. And this actually gives rise to a connection between Europeans and Native Americans that is somewhat unexpected, perhaps. Um, and actually, we kind of see the same thing in dogs. So we see these links that connect European dogs, especially these Karelian and Northern European dogs, uh, connect these dogs to dogs in Siberia and also the first American dogs. So there's this kind of mirroring of the relationships that we see in humans. And as you say, we know a thing or two about the processes that gave rise to these relationships in humans, but it's also kind of puzzling to think about how they would arise in a similar fashion in dogs, because some of these relationships that were laid down in humans were established before dogs were even domesticated. So, kind of
Mhm.
20,000 years ago, perhaps, you had these links that connected Europeans and Native Americans. But at this point, there probably wasn't even dogs. Um, so somehow later processes in dog populations have kind of mimicked in some way the
Yeah.
relationships that were already in place in humans, which is kind of an interesting thing that we don't really understand. Perhaps there were kind of similar uh, geographical factors that would enable movement throughout northern Eurasia. Perhaps it was kind of a relatively uniform environment where you can move without major geographical barriers, and that there was continuous movement, which in the early times established these links between human populations, and perhaps later on established similar links between dog populations.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned this in the paper, and it's a pretty interesting result. I want to step back on the correlation between humans and dogs in terms of genetic relatedness. So, my understanding, from what I recall in the paper, is you used Procustes analysis, where you're basically rotating principal component plots, or these these spatial plots, until they minimize the differences. Is that correct?
Yeah, so you basically do a clustering with this PCA technique. You cluster the dogs based on their genetic relationships to each other, and then you cluster the humans as well. And then, as I mentioned, we have these pairs of dogs and humans, so we can link each one of them up and then rotate the two results so that they minimize the differences between them. Uh, and so, what emerges is a a picture of population relationships in the two species that is somewhat similar to each other. So there's a positive correlation between these two views of population relationships, um, where much of it is driven by uh, this observation that I mentioned of connections between dogs throughout the northern hemisphere, um, and kind of on the other end of that spectrum of population structure, you find populations in the Near East, so in the Levant and Iran, um, with in both cases, both humans and dogs, European populations are
Yeah.
kind of somewhat intermediate between these two.
Yeah, that was a weird wasn't entirely shocking, but it was still a weird result. And so what you're alluding to, Anders, is that if you're looking at genetic affinities, people in East Asia, uh, their distance to people in the Middle East is greater than their distance to people in Europe. And just I think reader or listeners can have inferred from the previous things you've said that the East Asian dogs are probably closer to European dogs than they're to Near Eastern dogs. And again, that is that is in the main correct, at least from your ancient DNA results. So it's just recapitulating these human patterns in some ways. And your correlation that you got from, I think like comparing the trees, concordance, whatnot, is like 0.48, which, anyone out there who's worked in social science or biology knows that 0.48 is not a trivial correlation, but it's at that range where there's broad structural similarities, but then there's also deviations, and so the deviations need to be followed up on because they're interesting too, because they're telling slightly different things. And so I want to jump to one of those deviations. You have a dog from the Srubna culture, which flourished in, say, around the Lower Volga region, I believe, 3,800 years ago, 4,000 years ago, somewhere in that range. It's a post Yamna culture, so we probably think it's Indo-European. Probably it is ancestral to Slavic people and Indo-Iranian people, perhaps just Indo-Iranian, but somewhere in that range. Saddam culture, Indo-European. You have a sample from there. Can you talk about how it's related to the dogs around the world now?
Yeah, so we do have this one dog. It's 3.8 thousand years old from the steppe. And so an interesting question that is remained unanswered is, what was the impact of, if any, of the migrations of people from the steppe uh, on the level of dogs? So we know that on the human side, these people, pastoralists from the steppe, they migrated into Europe, and they had a major impact on the genetics of European populations, replacing perhaps as much as half of the ancestry of Northern Europeans, and then less in Southern Europe, and also a sizable impact on people in South Asia, as you mentioned. Um, we also know that they actually migrated eastwards as well, and they reached as far as kind of Mongolia and Western China. However, here they don't seem to have made a big impact on the genetics of the humans in East Asia. So there's maybe a few percent admixture from these people, but a much lower impact than what you see in Europe. So a natural question is, did the same thing happen in dogs, or were there perhaps different patterns? And so this steppe dog that we have, that is 3.8 thousand years old, it is largely speaking similar to other West Eurasian dogs, um, but it's not really clustering with, let's say, European Neolithic dogs. So it's somewhat different. We can't quite nail it down. But if we then ask, okay, as we move forward in time and we move into the Bronze Age, do we see a similar process where dogs in Europe become more like these steppe populations? And there are a few kind of potentially intriguing links with a few dog individuals in the Bronze Age. But overall, we do not really see the same kind of impact on the dogs. So instead, present day European dogs, they basically look like dogs in the Neolithic, so before this large scale expansion. So, I mean, I think ultimately we will need more dogs from the steppe to really understand this process. But as far as we can tell, there doesn't seem to have been a similarly large scale admixture of steppe dogs into Europe. On the other hand, if we look eastwards, there's a intriguing signal where basically all present day dogs in China and Siberia display affinities to this dog from the steppe. So potentially, although this is also somewhat uncertain at this point, but potentially it could be that the steppe people, while they didn't leave a big impact genetically on humans in the East, their dogs actually had a big impact, and perhaps these steppe dogs spread their ancestry throughout much of East Asia. In which case, you would have a kind of an interesting difference between the impact that humans and dogs had in different parts of Eurasia following these steppe migrations.
Yeah. So a question on that. So the ancient East Asian dogs, they don't show any evidence of this.
Well, so unfortunately, we don't really have ancient dogs from let's say East Asia proper, like China or so. We have these Baikal dogs, uh, which are basically southern Siberia.
Mm,
but they are very different. They
mm,
don't really show this affinity. But there was one quite interesting study from the lab of Xiaomei Fu, who studied mitochondrial genomes from dogs in China. So it's just mitochondria, but it still gives you some insight. And basically, they found that um, prior to 4 or 5 thousand years ago, Chinese dogs mainly had the same type of mitochondria that you find in dingoes and New Guinea singing dogs populations. So the kind of what we think of as the older East Asian ancestry. But that after that, there is a influx of more West Eurasian related mitochondria. So that might also potentially speak towards an influx of Western dogs into East Asia. Um, Although this is also complicated by the fact that today there's a lot of admixture from European breeds in virtually all Chinese dogs that we're studying. So, but but
mm,
but there might be a deeper layer of West Eurasian ancestry that it's predating the emergence of European breeds and could
mm.
potentially be linked to these steppe migrations.
Well, I mean, yeah, I want to get to the European breeds because there's also some weird. I mean, just in terms of European canine ancestry, canine history, which has a huge impact on the rest of the world, as you allude to in the paper. That was one of the findings. It wasn't entirely surprising. I've actually, like as you know, I've looked at the cat genome work pretty intensely, and I have an unfinished finished paper somewhere that maybe someday will see the light of day. But
All right.
I actually found the exact same result that you did with
Okay.
cats.
Hmm.
With um, basically all modern cats. I mean, maybe I shouldn't be saying this on the podcast. I don't know if the result is ever going to be published, so I might as well say it. But basically, all modern cats outside of Europe, pretty much, unless they're like a really weird, obscure, isolated breed, show European ancestry. So it's obviously colonialism, and you saw that in Europe. I do want to say though, I wrote an article for Quillette. And I mentioned offhand, you find this result for the Srubna ancestry in these East Asian dogs. One thing that, and I actually mentioned this to your PI Pontus, is that chariots in North China during the Shang Dynasty around 1200 BC, they show up and they don't show any evolutionary progress of stepwise production of chariots. They're obviously copied from Sintashta chariots from the steppe. So we know that the Chinese were engaged in widespread borrowing of some cultural artifacts from steppe people. Obviously because of language, the various non-Chinese groups that are described in the ancient Chinese historical annals are quite hard to map onto, like, references that we have from other histories, partly just because the names are different. But it's not implausible that some of those were Indo-European. As you mentioned, we do have evidence of Indo-Europeans relatively close in Western China, in Mimi, the Gansu corridor. So I think that your result from the Srubna dog makes total sense in light of that. If you think of a dog as a cultural artifact, which I think you can think of dogs that way. They're
Yeah.
they're they're basically a technology. Like if you think of them as a tool, hunters, beasts of burden. Um, so I've been told that dogs showed up in, I think, the Andaman Islands relatively recently, but this is the Great Andamans, not Sentinel Island, and the islanders immediately started using them as hunting dogs.
Hmm.
So um, it's relatively easy for humans to understand what to do with dogs. There's only a finite amount of thing, and dogs are well adapted to humans. So I want to get to Europe. We've been talking about these Neolithic dogs and the Karelian dogs and the admixture Klein, but that doesn't actually describe what's happening in Europe at all today. So can you talk about what's going on there and the relevance for the rest of the world?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, we have this quite large diversity of dogs genetically in Europe that we think reflects this ancient admixture events where Siberian related and Near Eastern related dogs come together. And throughout the Neolithic, up until 4 or 5 thousand years ago, a lot of this diversity is retained. So, for example, we have dogs in Sweden as late as 4.8 thousand years ago that still look very much like Siberian dogs in terms of their ancestry. But then, if we look at present day European dogs, they all kind of cluster together and they display only just a fraction of the diversity that used to exist. So they all look very much like each other, and we don't understand the process behind this. But at some point in the last 4,000 years ago, European dogs must have been homogenized to a great extent, perhaps because a single population expanded from somewhere within the continent and basically replaced everyone else, such that most local populations did not contribute to present day dog diversity. And so it's kind of remarkable to think about this, especially in terms of the enormous trait diversity that we see among present day European breeds, in terms of their size and appearance and behavior. Um, Despite this, they genetically derive from just a small subset of the variation that used to exist in Europe, and was through some process largely erased in the last 4,000 years.
Yeah, I mean, so what you're saying is, in terms of descent, in terms of ancestry, these European dogs that we see around, like, these big ones, these little ones, all the diversity is due to a lot of recent selection on the same ancestral lineage, which comes from, one of the daughter lineages of this Neolithic Karelian cline, correct?
Yes, so there is some source population that we think it fell kind of roughly in the middle of this cline, um, and it seems to have expanded uh, and then replaced other dogs, such that as a consequence, for example, if you take a present day dog from Spain, it has no extra affinity to a Neolithic dog from Spain, and a present day dog from Britain has no extra affinity to a Neolithic dog from Britain. So there is very little, if any, local continuity, um, and instead there is a quite dramatic turnover of ancestry, such that all of these phenotypically diverse European dogs probably trace their ancestry to the same source population at some point in the last 4,000 years.
Yeah, and in the paper you were quite clear that you are unclear what the process is, correct? Like, I mean, what happened, and
Yeah, I mean, we basically have no idea, and I mean, it was a very surprising result, and it's an example of where dog history does not mirror human history. I mean, we find that in many cases they do, and we earlier discussed these examples of how kind of the global population structure across North Eurasia is kind of similar in humans and dogs. Um, and other examples, including, for example, the influx of Near Eastern ancestry into Europe during the Neolithic. But this is an example of something that happens in dog populations that is not mirrored at all in the human population. So there's no equivalent turnover in European ancestry. Instead, humans in Europe retain much more diversity and more deeper relationships to earlier populations in the Neolithic. So it's not obvious at all what could have been driving this turnover in dog ancestry. If it was a human cultural process, perhaps it was a preference for a particular type of dog. We simply don't know, and we don't really know the timing of it either. We can basically just say that it was at some point in the last 4,000 years.
yeah,
I mean, it's kind of tempting to speculate. Could this be linked to the arrival of steppe pastoralists
yeah,
from Eastern Europe? Um, and I think it's hard to rule that out. But at least the ancestry that does take over, it's not particularly related to the steppe dog that we have. It seems to be uh, a so to speak endogenous European dog ancestry. that expands. Um,
Yeah.
so there's no clear link to the arrival of Indo-European speakers, and I think we will need more dog genomes from later time periods to both figure out the timing of this replacement event and also its geographical origins.
Mhm. And so, I alluded to this earlier. Another result that you found is the single European lineage that replaced all the others in Europe also had a huge outside impact on the rest of the world. Like I'm seeing from your results, not entirely surprising because it mirrors the humans, but even the dingoes in Australia, some of your samples have a fair amount of this European ancestry.
That's right, and I mean, I guess this mainly reflects dispersals of European dogs in the colonial age, the last few hundred years, such that today it is a major component of dog ancestry in many parts of the world. But it's also interesting to notice that we do detect um, some of the deeper local ancestries in quite a few parts of the world. So, for example, um, I mentioned previously that African dogs seem to be descendants of this uh, Neolithic dog populations in the Levant. So it seems that there is a kind of a relatively simple history where dogs entered Africa from the Levant, um, and much of this is still retained. This kind of endogenous African dog ancestry is still retained in African village dogs, but it's also retained, for example, in the Rhodesian Ridgeback, which is a popular breed. We estimate that it has something like 3% ancestry from this ultimately Levantine ancestry. And in Mexico, we know previously that in the Americas, much of the local dog ancestry was replaced by European dogs after the arrival of Europeans. But we estimate, for example, in the Chihuahua and the Mexican hairless dog, that they trace a few percent of their ancestry back to the pre-Columbian Native American dog ancestry.
Hmm.
So some of these early diversifying deep lineages still persists in different parts of the world, even if there's now in many places an additional layer of recent European admixture.
Yeah, and I want to mention these New World dogs. They were already existent phenotypically when the Spaniards, for example, in Mexico, when the Aztec Empire arrived. These phenotypes were already in existence, and the weird result from genetics, which people have been, confirming for almost 2 decades now, is most of the genealogical ancestry was replaced, and yet the phenotypic descriptions of the current dogs match what the Spaniards saw when they arrived, which is indicative of selection, maintaining that phenotype or recreating that phenotype. I don't know. Um, Despite the fact of like total genetic turnover, in East Asia, you also have substantial admixture. It's not as much turnover there, but I know that historically or culturally, there is a distinction between all these East Asian breeds, Pekingese, all the like the Chinese lap dogs and whatnot, and the European breeds. But it looks like all the East Asian dogs also have the exact same. They have a lot of European influence.
Yeah, and even many village dogs seem to have a lot of European admixture. Um, so yeah, I think this is an example of where ancient DNA really helps, because you can then get past these recent admixture events, which often complicate analyses quite greatly, and you can look at diversity in the past.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do have a question. You have a result on EPAS 2, I think, the high altitude adaptation, which has been found in humans. In Tibet, and it's also been found in Tibetan dogs, I think Tibetan mastiffs. And the hypothesis there, which is, kind of seems correct, is that it came in from Tibetan wolves, but you don't see any admixture from Tibetan wolves in the mastiff overall.
That's right. So on a genome-wide level, we don't detect any particular affinity to Tibetan wolves in the Tibetan dogs. Um, However, that doesn't mean that that particular gene is not introgressed from Tibetan wolves. Um, I think that's still very likely that they have, due to selection, just retained this particular gene that is beneficial to high altitude lifestyles. And so, I mean, it's actually kind of a crazy parallel to human evolution, where in present day populations in the Himalayas, there's a gene, as you say, EPAS1, that is inherited from most likely Denisovans, so this archaic group of humans, um, and confers an adaptation to high altitude. But on a genome-wide level, people in Tibet and the Himalayas, they have just very small levels of Denisovan ancestry, perhaps 0.1%. So perhaps it's a similar situation in dogs. They have just uh, received a very tiny bit of introgression from local uh, populations, but there's then selection on this particular gene that has an adaptive advantage. So you see it on the local level of that gene, but not on a genome-wide level.
Yeah, yeah, and just to give the listener some intuition, like if you have, probability of fixation of a new mutation is basically just its frequency within the population. If it's neutral, if there's no selection favoring it, but obviously it's going to be different if selection is favoring it, and so you could think of selection coefficients approximately the same as the selection coefficient. So if you had like a little bit of admixture, I don't know, if you had like 10, 20, 30 admixture events that are introducing this EPAS1 in some ancient, proto Tibetan Mastiff population, um, it's pretty easy to see how it could just bleed over due to natural selection. But the rest of the genome, one, it could be swamped out just through admixture, which, as Anders is talking about, it's happening all over the world, especially because the European colonial dogs, but also it just could be, the genome could purify that ancestry because they're too diverged. Probably not because wolves are pretty close. I think it's probably they were just swamped out. So I mean, it makes sense. It's not like the most shocking result. So I want to ask you about adaptation and amylase. That's kind of like at the end of your paper, and this is a literature that's been around for, again, I think it's 20 years, and it's another one which is paralleling humans to dogs, and there's been a lot of debate and controversy whether it means anything. And what did you find?
Yes, so this is a gene that is involved in the digestion of starch. So amylase is an enzyme that digests starch molecules. And so, as you say, we've known for a long time that a big difference between wolves and dogs is that many dogs, not all, but most dogs today, have high copy numbers of this gene. So there's been duplications of this gene. That's a common way to quickly evolve uh, a new phenotype. Rather than creating new genes, you make additional copies of the ones you have. And so in this case, you can more efficiently digest starch if you have more copies. And it's natural to believe that this would have been beneficial to dogs who lived alongside humans who were practicing agriculture, such that they could eat the agricultural products that humans produced. Um, and so when we look across ancient dogs and quantify how many copies they had, um, we see that there's quite a lot of variation. So um, some quite early dogs already had expanded copy numbers, but others, even ones from agriculturalist human context, had low copy numbers, even several thousand years after the adoption of agriculture. So this doesn't seem to have been a very rapid process where all dogs just obtained high copy numbers through very rapid adaptation as soon as agriculture came about. But it seems to have been a more slow and variable process. And I mean, in fact, still today there are dogs that have low copy numbers, but especially those that live, for example, in the North American Arctic, where they presumably mostly eat meat. Um,
Yeah.
but it's also interesting that in humans, there's a similar adaptation going on. It's a different gene. So in dogs um, and humans, it's two different genes, but they're both amylase genes. So it's an example of parallel evolution. But when people have looked at this in ancient DNA in humans, it doesn't seem strongly linked to agriculture. So the increase in copy numbers in humans appears to start even before agriculture. Um, even early in the Pleistocene, you find humans with expanded copy numbers. Um,
Hmm.
so it might be a quite complex situation, but at least in dogs, I think it's quite likely that it is linked to an adaptation to an agricultural diet. And indeed, we see generally lower copy numbers in the ancient dogs that come from hunter-gatherer contexts, as opposed to those that come from agriculturalist contexts.
Yeah, I wanna say that, with selection and humans, there's been kind of a change over the I'd say last 5 years, where people are moving away from these single gene, strong selective sweep models to selection on standing variation, which, just like variation that's already out there, and you're changing the underlying allele frequencies. There's a lot more complexity, and I think we're at the beginning of scratching the surface on that. Um, I want to ask you, like, what's going on with canine genomics in the future? Like, what are you seeing? I mean, where do you think that this will go? Because I think you've admitted it in this podcast. There are some holes in your ancient DNA. There's still stuff that needs to be discovered and kind of explored.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, as we talked about in the beginning, the big question is still unsolved. The domestication question: where do dogs come from? Um, we still don't know the geographical origin. The time scale is somewhat known, but still a bit fuzzy. Um, so I think that's still a big mystery that remains to be solved. And to do that, I think will require even older DNA than what we have analyzed here, and ultimately DNA from gray wolves as well, because that's ultimately the source of dogs. So that's one direction, kind of going into the deeper past. But then I think also going towards the more recent time periods as well, where now ancient DNA studies of humans has exploded and become an enormous field where people are studying a number of different histories in different parts of the world and different time periods. And in principle, you can do the same for dogs. And that the history of dogs and other domesticated animals is in many ways an additional layer on top of our understanding of human history. So there will be a range of local histories to resolve in different parts of the world, and ask questions about to what extent dog history in a particular part of the world in a particular time period mirrors what we see in humans. So I think this is just a beginning, really, for ancient DNA studies in dogs.
Sounds like there's going to be a lot more work for you guys, which is great. So thank you for your time, Dr. Bergstrom, Anders. This is a fascinating paper, fascinating work. I think that people will be super interested in it. Again, I'm going to just say the name so that people can Google it if they have access to science. But it is Origins and Genetic Legacy of Prehistoric Dogs. First author is Anders Bergstrom, and the last author is Pontus Skoglund. So this is out of the Skoglund lab at the Crick Institute, right?
Yes, definitely. But it's also very collaborative. So we work with
Yes.
people from especially Oxford and the University of Vienna, as well as a large number of archaeologists.
Yes, I see some familiar names. Ron Panassi's on there. Grigor Larson's on there. So
Hmm.
it's all the great and the mighty, in the canine and ancient DNA and archaeology world. So although it's not one of those GWAS papers with 200 authors. It's more like
Right, right.
more like 30. It's like it's a reasonable number. All right. Thank you for your time, Anders. This is great. It was a great paper. It's well written, and I hope you have a good rest of the year.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This podcast for kids.